It was just another Thursday evening, or so I told myself as I stood by the window, watching the late autumn sun dip below the horizon. The air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves and something else, something sweeter. My heart still raced from earlier that afternoon, a subtle yet undeniable flutter that hadn't left me since. The knock on my door had been light, almost hesitant, as if he, my neighbor, was unsure whether I'd be home. When I opened the door, there he stood, holding a bouquet of sunflowers, their bright yellow petals a sharp contrast to the soft gray of his sweater. I remember the way he smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting in a way that felt both warm and disarming. "For you," he said simply, his voice low and steady. The flowers were fresh, their scent mingling with the faint cologne he always wore. I took them, my fingers brushing his, and for a fleeting moment, the touch lingered longer than it should have. I didn't say much, just a murmured thank you as I stepped aside to let him in. He'd been over before, but something about today felt different, heavier, charged. I set the flowers in a vase, stealing glances at him as he wandered into my living room. His presence had always been calming, yet today it ignited something else in me. I told myself it was nothing, just a friendly gesture, but my thoughts betrayed me. Why had he brought flowers? Why had his touch sent a shiver down my spine? The memory of his scent lingered long after he'd settled onto the couch, his gaze scanning my bookshelf as if searching for something to ground him. I tried to focus on making tea, my hands trembling slightly as I poured the water. The quiet in the room stretched between us, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken words, with questions I couldn't yet bring myself to ask. As I brought the tea to the table, our eyes met, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. The way he looked at me, curious, tender, as if he could see every thought racing through my mind, made my chest tighten. I wondered if he could sense the tension, the way my resolve was beginning to crumble under the weight of his presence. And yet, I couldn't look away. The evening stretched ahead, and I knew this was only the beginning. He leaned back on the couch, his fingers lightly trailing along the armrest as he spoke about his day. I listened, but my attention faltered, drawn instead to the way his hands moved, strong, yet careful. There was a pause in his story, and I realized he was watching me, his lips curving into a knowing smile. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice teasing. I shrugged, attempting nonchalance. "Just tired, I guess." But even as I spoke, my hand brushed against his when I reached for my cup. The contact was electric, and I froze, unsure whether to pull away or let the moment linger. To my surprise, he didn't move either. Instead, his fingers grazed mine, deliberate this time, his touch warm and grounding. "Tired, huh?" he murmured, his tone softer now, almost a whisper. The corner of his mouth quirked upward again, but there was no teasing in his eyes, only something deeper, something I couldn't name. My heart raced as the silence stretched between us, heavy with possibilities. "Why did you bring me flowers?" The question slipped out before I could stop myself. I glanced down, suddenly feeling vulnerable under his steady gaze. He hesitated, as if weighing his words. "Because you deserve them," he said finally. "And maybe because I needed an excuse to see you." His honesty took me by surprise, leaving me momentarily speechless. Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face. The gesture was simple, but it sent a shiver through me, his fingers lingering near my cheek before pulling away. "Is that okay?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. I nodded, my breath catching as our eyes met again. "Yes," I whispered. A tentative smile spread across his face, and the warmth in his expression melted away any lingering hesitation I had. He leaned closer, the distance between us narrowing until I could feel the heat radiating from him. For a moment, the world outside faded, leaving only the quiet hum of our connection. "I'm glad," he said softly, his voice steady yet full of emotion. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, and I held on, letting the warmth of his touch ground me. The air between us shifted, charged with a mix of longing and comfort, as if we'd both been waiting for this moment longer than either of us cared to admit. As the evening wore on, The air between us grew heavier, laden with an unspoken intensity that neither of us dared to address outright. He reached for his cup, his fingers brushing mine once again, but this time, neither of us pulled away. His hand lingered, and I felt the warmth of his skin seep into mine, grounding me in the moment. "You're trembling," he said softly, his gaze meeting mine with a mixture of concern and something deeper, something that sent a shiver down my spine. He shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine, the contact sparking an undeniable tension. I looked away, unable to bear the intensity of his stare. "It's just the tea," I murmured, though my voice betrayed me, trembling as much as my hands. He chuckled softly, a low, soothing sound that made my pulse quicken. "Tea doesn't do that," he replied, his voice teasing yet gentle. His hand moved to my wrist, his touch light but steady, grounding me even as my thoughts spiraled. "Talk to me. What's going on?" I hesitated, my lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, I met his gaze, and the look in his eyes unraveled something deep inside me. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us until our foreheads nearly touched. "I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't let me finish. His hand moved to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his breath warm against my face. His touch was tentative, as if afraid I might pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, letting the warmth of his hand anchor me. The space between us disappeared, and before I could think, his lips brushed against my forehead. The kiss was soft, fleeting, but it left me breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. "Is this okay?" he asked again, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable vulnerability. "Yes," I whispered, the word carrying more weight than I realized. My hand moved to his, our fingers intertwining as I held on tightly, grounding myself in the moment. The tension between us was palpable, a quiet hum that filled the room and drowned out everything else. He leaned in again, his lips brushing against my temple, then my cheek, each kiss soft and deliberate as if savoring the moment. My breath hitched as his hand moved to my waist, his touch light yet grounding, and I felt myself leaning into him, unable to resist the pull. "I've wanted to do this for so long," he murmured against my skin, his voice low and filled with emotion. His confession sent a shiver through me, and I realized, with startling clarity, that I felt the same. "Me too," I admitted, my voice barely audible but steady. The weight of my words hung between us, and for the first time, I felt a sense of clarity, as if everything had led to this moment. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer until I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine. The embrace was grounding, a quiet reassurance that neither of us was alone in this. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, the unspoken tension between us finally finding its voice. The silence between us was warm, but it didn't last. He pulled back just enough to cup my face with both hands, his eyes searching mine for any trace of doubt. I met his gaze, my hands moving to rest on his forearms as I nodded, silently giving him permission. His lips found mine, tentative at first, a soft brush, testing the waters, but it didn't take long for the kiss to deepen. It was everything I hadn't known I was waiting for, a release of the tension that had been building between us for weeks, months, maybe longer. My fingers found their way to his shoulders, gripping him as if I might lose my balance. His hands moved gently, tracing the line of my jaw before settling on my waist. He pulled me closer, our bodies aligning in a way that felt both natural and electrifying. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, steady and reassuring, even as my own threatened to race out of control. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads rested together, both of us breathless, but unwilling to let the moment slip away. "I've been waiting for this," he admitted softly, his voice laced with emotion. "So have I whispered, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. My hands slid down to his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. He smiled, a soft, unguarded expression that made my heart ache. "Then let's not waste any more time," he said, his voice a quiet promise. His arms tightened around me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself believe that this moment, this connection, was exactly where I was meant to be. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. I stirred, my senses awakening to the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream, but then I felt the warmth of his hand still holding mine. I turned my head to find him watching me, his gaze tender and unguarded. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft and filled with warmth. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability in his expression mirrored my own, and I realized how much had changed in just a few hours. We lay there in silence for a while, the weight of the previous night settling over us. It wasn't heavy, though it was grounding, a quiet assurance that we were exactly where we needed to be. His thumb brushed over the back of my hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. "Last night," he began, his voice trailing off as if searching for the right words. "It wasn't just a moment, was it?" I shook my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. "No, it was more than that." His hand tightened around mine, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of his presence, not just as my neighbor, but as someone who had quietly become so much more. "I don't want this to be the end," he admitted, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "It doesn't have to be," I said softly, the words carrying a quiet promise. He smiled, his eyes lighting up in a way that made my heart ache. "Then let's see where this goes." And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. The uncertainty of the future didn't scare me anymore, not with him by my side. The flowers on the table had begun to wilt, but their presence still filled the room with warmth, a reminder of how it all began. As he pulled me closer, I realized that sometimes the smallest gestures could lead to the biggest changes. And this was only the beginning.